He was forced out into the freezing coastal night with nothing left but a wounded heart, a military backpack, and the loyal K9, who refused to leave his side. But deep in the fog of Greyhaven, Maine, a forgotten $8 cottage near an abandoned lighthouse became the door God used to change his fate forever. A broken Navy SEAL and his aging German Shepherd walked into that ruined place with no money, no home, and no one waiting for them. But what they uncovered inside the lighthouse would expose a buried truth, heal a grieving daughter, bring justice to a forgotten refuge, and turn one shattered cottage into a sanctuary for every lost soul still trying to find the way home. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe God can turn broken places into miracles, comment, Amen. Greyhaven, Maine, sat under a coastal winter storm that made the whole town seem older than it was. With sleet sliding across the harbor lamps, snow gathering on the black ropes of fishing boats, and the Atlantic wind pushing through the narrow streets like it had a personal grudge against anyone still trying to stay upright after midnight. Nathan Cole stood near Pier 3, with salt crusting on his boots and freezing rain darkening the shoulders of his harbor coat. A 39-year-old former Navy SEAL operative with a lean, hard-built frame, broad shoulders that never fully relaxed, short, dark blonde hair cut close, a clean-shaven face drawn tight by exhaustion, and gray eyes that had learned to watch doorways, rooftops, hands, reflections, and every sudden movement before they ever watched a man's smile. Beneath the coat, he still wore the practical pieces of his old discipline, like armor, a faded U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3 blouse, in AOR, 2 green digital woodland, matching trousers tucked into brown combat boots, not for pride or display, but because it was the last clothing that had ever made sense to him. And beside him moved Scout, his 8-year-old German Shepherd K9 partner, a sable male with brown gold fur, washed through with black along the spine, a dark mask over the muzzle and eyes, a thick chest, sharp ears, and amber eyes that carried the patience of an animal who had crossed deserts, ruins, checkpoints, and nightmares without once choosing himself first. The trouble began with a sound, nothing more dramatic than a steel crate slipping from a forklift and slamming against the dock with a violent metallic crash. Yet to Nathan, it was not a crate, not Greyhaven, not cold rain on wooden planks, but a flash of another place, where metal had screamed before dust swallowed the sun, and men shouted through smoke. He still could not force his mind to forget. He froze where he stood, one hand half raised, breath trapped in his chest, the harbor lights stretching into long white streaks as his thoughts fell backward into a memory, with no clean beginning and no safe ending, while Scout immediately pressed against his leg, shoulder firm, body angled between Nathan and the panicked dockhands. Earl Pritchard, the night foreman, was a square, heavy-set man in his late 50s, with a red wind-burned face, gray stubble, and the impatient temperament of someone who had spent 30 years believing every problem could be solved by shouting over machinery. And although he was not cruel by nature, he feared anything he could not predict. He marched over after the crate was secured, his yellow rain slicker snapping in the wind, and told Nathan in a lowered voice that the port could not afford another incident, that men who locked up around moving equipment were a liability, that maybe this was only temporary, but tonight Nathan needed to go home and not come back until someone called him. Nathan did not argue, because arguments required a kind of belonging he no longer possessed, and because Earl's eyes had already moved past him toward the schedule board, the damaged crate, the men pretending not to listen. He only nodded once, gathered his gloves from a wet pallet, and whistled softly for Scout, who left the dock without looking back at the men who had spent weeks calling him a good dog, while never quite knowing what he had carried Nathan through. The walk from the port to the harbor line rooms was less than 10 minutes in fair weather, but that night the streets felt stretched and hollow, the storefront windows dark, the sidewalks glazed in ice, the old clapboard buildings creaking under gusts off the water. Nathan kept his eyes low and his breathing measured, counting Scout's steps when the echoes of the fallen crate tried to return, and by the time he reached the narrow 2-story boarding house above a closed bait shop, snow had begun mixing with the rain in hard white grains that stung the skin. The harbor line was owned by Sarah Bell, a thin woman in her early 60s with narrow shoulders, silver hair pinned too tightly at the back of her head, and a careful, anxious face that had once been warm before years of unpaid rent. drunk fisherman, and a husband lost to a winter sea, had made her treat every desperate man as a storm that might break through her door. She stood waiting in the hallway, with Nathan's backpack and duffel already placed beside the stairs. Sarah's voice was not loud, but it had the brittle edge of someone trying to convince herself she was being practical instead of afraid. And she told him that Earl had called, that people were worried, that she ran a quiet house and could not have danger under her roof, especially not with that kind of dog in the building. Scout, who had never bitten without command, never lunged without reason, and had once dragged a wounded Marine through gunfire by the strap of his vest, stood perfectly still at Nathan's left side, while Sarah avoided looking into his eyes. Nathan wanted to explain that Scout was not the danger, that the danger had always been the things people left inside men when they sent them home and asked them to act normal, but the words felt too heavy for the narrow hallway. So he lifted the backpack over one shoulder, took the duffel in his right hand, and thanked her, because manners were easier than pain. Sarah looked smaller when he said it, her mouth tightening as if part of her wished he had shouted, wished he had given her a reason to feel innocent. But Nathan only stepped past her into the storm, and the door closed behind him with a click that sounded final enough to belong in a graveyard. The road out of Greyhaven curved along the black edge of the harbor, past lobster traps stacked like cages, past a shuttered church with snow collecting on its steps, past the old cannery where broken windows looked out at the sea like blind eyes. Nathan had $14 in his pocket, one protein bar in his duffel, no open room to return to, and no person in town who owed him more than a nod. Yet Scout walked beside him with steady purpose, occasionally nudging Nathan's hand whenever his breathing changed. The dog was older now, with a faint stiffness in one hind leg from an injury earned years earlier, but he still moved with the disciplined awareness of a trained K9, ears turning before Nathan heard anything, nose reading the world through storm, salt, oil, and fear. Nathan pulled his collar higher, telling himself to keep moving because stopping in weather like this was how men became stories told in diners the next morning, and he had spent too long surviving to let cold pavement decide the ending. A pair of headlights appeared behind them then, hazed by snow, bouncing too fast along the iced road, and Nathan shifted toward the shoulder without raising his head, because people in warm trucks rarely slowed for men walking nowhere at night. The truck fishtailed before it reached them, its rear sliding wide on a glassy patch near the bend, tires hissing, headlights swinging across Nathan's face so suddenly that for one suspended second he was back under a different light, bracing for impact he could not name. His body locked. Scout did not. The German Shepherd lunged upward, jaws clamping around the sleeve of Nathan's coat, and with a brutal sideways pull born from years of training and instinct, he dragged Nathan off the road and down the frozen embankment as the truck blasted past close enough to throw dirty snow across Nathan's legs. The vehicle corrected itself and continued into the storm without stopping, its taillights disappearing between sheets of white, while Nathan lay half-twisted in the ditch, chest heaving, one hand buried in Scout's fur, his pulse hammering so hard it seemed to shake the ground beneath him. Scout stood over him, ears forward, breath steaming, amber eyes fixed on Nathan's face. And when Nathan tried to sit up too quickly, the dog lowered his head and pressed his warm forehead against Nathan's sternum, holding him down until the worst of the trembling passed. "Good boy," Nathan whispered, voice almost lost under the wind, and he did not know whether he meant for the road, the war, the years after, or every dark moment Scout had refused to let him vanish inside. They climbed from the ditch slowly, Nathan brushing snow from his coat with fingers gone stiff from cold, and together they kept walking toward the center of town because the wind off the water had sharpened and the open road no longer felt survivable. The old Greyhaven Municipal Building stood at the end of Harbor Street, a stone structure from another century with green copper gutters, boarded basement windows, and a covered entrance where notices curled on a public board behind cracked glass. Nathan stopped beneath the overhang, only because his legs demanded it, leaning one shoulder against the cold wall, while Scout shook ice from his coat and began sniffing near the board with unusual focus. At first, Nathan ignored him, eyes fixed on the empty street and the weak glow of a diner sign 2 blocks away. But Scout pawed once at the wooden frame, then looked back with that silent, deliberate stare Nathan had learned never to dismiss. Nathan stepped closer and saw, tucked beneath an old fishing permit announcement and a faded charity flyer, a county auction notice printed on pale blue paper, its lower edge damp but readable. Abandoned coastal properties, minimum bids accepted. Buyer assumes all risk, no utilities guaranteed. One-room lighthouse cottage near North Point Head, opening bid, $8. For a moment, Nathan only stared. Because $8 was too small to be real and too large to ignore when a man had 14 left and nowhere legal to sleep. The listing described the cottage as storm-damaged, remote, unsafe in winter, abandoned for over a decade, and located near the old North Point Lighthouse, which the town had sealed after years of accidents, trespass warnings, and rumors no one cared to explain in writing. Nathan gave a short breath that was almost a laugh but had no humor in it, then read the date again and saw the auction was scheduled after sunrise in the same building where he now stood shaking under the overhang. Scout leaned against his knee, not pushing this time, simply grounding him, as if the dog understood that fate sometimes arrived without warmth, without music, without any sign, except wet paper under cracked glass. Nathan touched the pocket where the $14 sat folded around his military ID, and for the first time since the harbor crate hit the dock, something inside him shifted from endurance toward decision. $8, he murmured, looking down at Scout. That would leave us 6. Scout's tail moved once, slow and certain, and Nathan let the silence answer for both of them. They did not sleep, not truly, because there was still the cold to survive and hours to cross before sunrise. So Nathan followed the glow of the diner sign through the storm, Scout close at his left knee, both of them framed in the empty street like the last two figures in a town that had already gone to bed. The diner was called Grace Harbor Coffee, though locals simply called it Grace's, and when the bell above the door rang, warm air rolled over Nathan's face carrying coffee, fried potatoes, and the soft electric hum of old ceiling lights. Behind the counter stood Grace Miller, 34 years old, medium height, with a strong but gentle build, auburn hair tied in a loose braid, tired hazel eyes that missed very little, and the calm manner of a woman who had spent years working night shifts as a nurse before returning to run her late mother's diner. Grace was kind to people, but not easily fooled. The disappearance of her father, Thomas Miller, a decorated veteran who had vanished years ago while searching for records tied to the sealed North Point Lighthouse, had made her careful with strangers and fiercely protective of anyone who carried the same quiet damage he once had. Around her neck hung an old silver dog tag on a thin chain, the stamped name Thomas Miller dulled by time and thumbprints, and when she saw Nathan's uniform trousers, his boots, the haunted control in his posture, and Scout's trained position at his side, she did not ask what had happened. Grace only reached for a mug, filled it with coffee, and slid it across the counter toward the booth nearest the heater, then placed a bowl of water on the floor for Scout with the same respect she might have offered a working partner rather than a pet. "You can sit there as long as you need," she said, her voice low enough not to make Charity sound like Charity, and Nathan, who had been prepared for suspicion, rules, explanations, or the familiar request that the dog stay outside, found himself unable to answer for several seconds. He lowered into the booth with his backpack against the wall, and Scout settling at his feet, the dog's wet coat steaming faintly in the warmth, while Grace turned away to wipe the counter and pretended not to see the way Nathan's hands shook around the mug. Outside, Greyhaven vanished behind snow and sea fog. The harbor lamps blurred into pale circles, and somewhere beneath the cracked glass of the municipal notice board, the $8 cottage near the abandoned lighthouse waited for sunrise like a final door left unlocked by a world that had closed every other one. Nathan looked down at Scout, then across the diner at the silver dog tag against Grace Miller's throat, and although he did not yet understand how their stories would cross, he felt the faintest pull of something larger than shelter, something hidden in the storm, calling both of them toward North Point Head. By the time morning pushed a thin gray light over Greyhaven, the storm had weakened into a cold mist that clung to the harbor roofs and turned every rope, railing, and window ledge silver with ice, while Nathan Cole sat in the back booth of Grace Harbor Coffee, with both hands around a cup that had gone lukewarm, Scout lying beneath the table with his sable coat nearly dry and his amber eyes half closed but never fully asleep. Grace Miller moved quietly behind the counter, her auburn braid loose over one shoulder, her face carrying the guarded softness of a woman who had learned not to press men for stories before they were ready to survive, telling them, And when Nathan finally rose, leaving 2 folded dollars beside the mug, though she had never asked him to pay, she only gave him a small nod toward the municipal building across the street. "Auction starts at 7, she said, not as a question, not as advice, but as if she had already understood what the wet blue notice meant to a man with nowhere else to go, and Nathan answered with the faintest lift of his chin before Scout stood beside him, stiff in one hind leg, yet steady as ever, ready to follow him into whatever came next. The auction room inside Greyhaven's old municipal building smelled of damp wool, burnt coffee, and paper files that had sat too long in metal cabinets, with folding chairs arranged in uneven rows and a dozen townspeople scattered through them, mostly for warmth, gossip, or the possibility of buying something cheap enough to fix and sell. At the front stood Everett Boone, the county auction clerk, a tall, narrow man in his late 40s with wire-rimmed glasses, a careful comb-over, and the dry, rule-bound personality of someone who trusted forms more than feelings, because forms rarely asked him to take sides. Beside the far wall sat Harlan Pike, an old fisherman with a white beard yellowed near the mouth from pipe smoke, thick knuckled hands folded over a cane, and a sharp tongue softened only by age and bad knees. He watched Nathan enter with Scout at his heel, then leaned toward another man and muttered something about North Point Head being no place for a drifter, though his eyes stayed more curious than cruel. Nathan took the last chair in the back, Scout folding down against his boot with the disciplined silence of a K9 who understood rooms full of strangers, and while the first lots passed in low voices rusted skiffs, lobster traps, a broken snowblower, 2 storage sheds with collapsed roofs, Nathan kept one thumb pressed against the folded bills in his pocket, as if they might disappear if he stopped feeling them. When Everett Boone reached the coastal properties, the room grew both bored and alert in the way small towns do, when something useless might still carry a story, and he read through the first 2 parcels with the flat voice of a man, hoping no one complicated his morning. Then he paused, adjusted his glasses, and lifted the pale blue sheet Nathan had seen under cracked glass the night before. "Lot 17, Everett said, 1-room cottage structure near North Point Head, adjacent to the old lighthouse access trail. Storm damaged. No utilities, no habitability guarantee. Title transferred as is. Buyer assumes all risk. Opening bid, $8. A few people chuckled before he had finished speaking, and Harlan Pike shook his head slowly, his weathered face tightening with the memory of storms that had taken men stronger than Nathan. "That place ain't worth the nails holding the ghosts in," he said loud enough for the room to hear, and another woman near the aisle crossed herself without looking up. Everett raised the small gavel, already preparing to move on, and asked whether there was any interest. Nathan lifted his hand. It was not dramatic, not proud, not desperate in any way the room could easily name, but every face turned, because a man offering $8 for the kind of ruin locals avoided was either foolish, broken, or seeing something the rest of them had stopped believing in. Everett blinked, cleared his throat, and repeated the bid as though the number might become more sensible if spoken twice, but nobody challenged it. Not Harlan, not the woman who had crossed herself, not the 2 men near the heater whispering about insurance and condemned structures. Scout raised his head when the room fell quiet, ears pricked, amber eyes moving from Everett to Nathan, as if listening for an order. $8 from Mr. Everett glanced down at the registration card Grace had quietly told Nathan to fill out before he entered, Mr. Nathan Cole. Any other bid? Silence held, filled only by the building's old radiator knocking in the wall, a hollow metallic rhythm that made Nathan's jaw tighten until Scout pressed his shoulder against his shin. Everett brought the gavel down with a soft wooden crack. Sold. The word landed in Nathan's chest heavier than it should have, because he had owned medals he never displayed, uniforms he no longer knew how to wear, and memories he could not throw away. But he had not owned a door, a patch of floor, or a place to stand without permission in longer than he cared to count. The paper deed was still warm from the printer when Nathan stepped back into the mist, and the town seemed to watch him differently as he crossed Harbor Street with Scout close beside him, not with welcome exactly, but with the uneasy attention people give a man who has just chosen a hardship they themselves refused. Grace stood in the diner doorway with her arms folded against the cold, the old silver dog tag at her throat catching a pale strip of morning light, and though she did not call out, her gaze followed Nathan with a worry she tried to hide behind stillness. Harlan Pike emerged from the municipal steps a few moments later, moving slowly with his cane, and stopped near Nathan, long enough to point the carved handle toward the northern road. "Trail turns past Widow's Spruce," he said, his voice rough as rope pulled over salt-wet wood. "Keep right when you hear the bell buoy, left when you smell kelp stronger than pine, and don't go near the lighthouse stairs after dark." Nathan looked at him, measuring whether the warning was kindness or superstition, but Harlan had already turned away, leaving only one more sentence behind him. "Your dog's got more sense than most men, so listen to him." The walk to North Point Head took them beyond the last line of shops, past weathered cottages with lobster buoys hanging like faded ornaments on fences, and into a coastal pine trail where the ground rose slowly toward the cliffs, and the ocean became a constant sound beyond the trees. Scout moved ahead at times, nose low, body alert, then circled back whenever Nathan's steps slowed on the icy roots. The path smelled of resin, wet stone, salt, and decaying seaweed, and every few minutes the fog opened enough for Nathan to glimpse the old lighthouse standing on the far point, white paint peeled to gray, lantern room dark, iron railings bent by years of weather. It looked less like a landmark than a forgotten witness. Nathan carried his duffel in one hand, the deed folded inside his coat, and as the trail narrowed, he felt the old military part of him mapping cover, exits, slope, wind direction, loose branches, possible shelter, while the exhausted civilian part of him simply hoped the structure at the end of the trail had enough roof left to keep death outside for one night. The cottage appeared in a dip below the lighthouse trail, crouched near the cliff edge behind a leaning fence and a wall of winter bare rose bushes, and for several seconds Nathan did not move, because seeing it made the $8 feel less like a miracle and more like a dare. The roof sagged toward the ocean side where shingles had torn away in dark patches. The front door hung crooked in its frame. One window was missing entirely, and the porch boards had warped upward as though the whole building had tried to breathe in a storm and never exhaled correctly again. The walls were cedar once, maybe strong once, but now they were gray, split, and furred with salt damp, while beneath the cottage the cliff dropped toward black rocks, where waves burst white and loud enough to shake the air. Scout climbed the porch first, careful with his older hind leg, then stopped near the threshold, with his nose lifted and a low rumble building in his chest. Nathan set the duffel down, slowly. Around the porch were marks that did not belong to weather. A boot print pressed into mud under the eave where the snow had not reached, a length of old rope coiled beneath the broken window, and a strip of dark oilcloth snagged on a thorn bush, still smelling faintly of smoke and brine when Nathan lifted it between two fingers. Inside, the cottage was colder than the air outside, because old buildings hold neglect differently than winter, storing it in the floorboards, the walls, the corners where no fire has burned for years. The single room contained a cracked stone hearth, a narrow counter stained by water, a rusted iron bed frame without a mattress, and a floor that dipped toward the center, as though tired of carrying its own history. Nathan moved through it with care, testing each board before trusting it, while Scout circled the perimeter, sniffing the broken window, the hearth, the far wall, then returning to the door with his ears angled toward the lighthouse above. There was no comfort in the room, not yet, but there was a boundary. There was a roof, even if it was wounded. There was a door Nathan could close, even if it did not fit. And when he stood in the middle of that cold, ruined space, he felt something quieter than hope and more dangerous than despair. He felt responsibility. "It's bad," he murmured, running a hand over the wall. "But it's ours." Scout leaned his weight against Nathan's leg, and the small pressure of that loyal body made the empty cottage feel, for one breath, less abandoned. By nightfall, the fog had thickened, and the wind off the Atlantic struck the cottage in long, punishing waves, forcing Nathan to wedge the door with his duffel and hang his coat over the missing window to slow the draft. He shared the protein bar with Scout, even though the dog accepted his half reluctantly, then stretched out on the driest section of floor with Scout pressed across his legs like a living anchor. Somewhere outside, beyond the roar of the sea, a metal sound began tapping at irregular intervals from the direction of the old lighthouse. A loose chain, perhaps, or a broken railing striking stone, but each sharp ring cut through Nathan's defenses and opened the old corridor inside his mind, where metal sounds belonged to pressure plates, torn vehicles, and the last seconds before men started shouting names into dust. His breathing changed before he could stop it. Scout felt it instantly. The German Shepherd rose, turned, and lowered himself across Nathan's thighs with deliberate weight, his chest warm, his head resting near Nathan's hand, grounding him not by command, but by presence. Nathan shut his eyes, fingers twisting gently into Scout's sable fur. "Not there," he whispered into the dark. North Point, Greyhaven, just wind and metal. The tapping continued, but Scout stayed heavy and steady until the memory lost its grip. Grace came near dawn, when the storm had thinned into mist, and the sky over the cliffs looked bruised with mourning. Carrying a canvas satchel, a small bottle of antiseptic, and a folded cloth in one hand, she had followed the trail alone with the careful courage of someone who had walked it before, and hated that she still remembered every turn. Her boots muddy, her braid damp, her hazel eyes taking in the cottage, the broken window, Nathan's pale face, and the faint scrape on Scout's front paw from the porch boards. "I saw him favoring it last night," she said, kneeling before Scout without fear, letting the dog smell her hand before she touched him. And Scout, who judged people faster than Nathan ever could, allowed her to clean the cut. While she worked, Grace spoke quietly, not looking at the lighthouse at first, explaining that her father, Thomas Miller, had been a Navy corpsman before he became a local advocate for veterans, who came home with no family, no records anyone cared to read, and no place to go, and that before he vanished in a storm years earlier, he believed North Point Lighthouse held a hidden list of forgotten servicemen whose names had been buried in county files and old promises. "People say he drowned," Grace said, tightening the cloth around Scout's paw with hands steadier than her voice. "But my father knew this trail. He knew storms, and he would not have come out here that night unless he had found something worth protecting." Nathan looked from her silver dog tag to the dark lighthouse above the cottage, feeling the $8 deed in his coat pocket like a weight and a warning. And as Scout rested calmly between them, the ocean hammered the rocks below, as if North Point Head had been waiting years for someone broken enough to listen. By the second evening on North Point Head, Greyhaven had disappeared behind a wall of sea fog and storm cloud, the harbor lights below reduced to pale, trembling dots whenever the mist broke for half a second, while the Atlantic rose against the cliffs with a violence that made the old cottage seem less like a shelter and more like a small wooden thing being dared to remain standing. Nathan Cole stood inside the one-room ruin with his faded U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3 blouse damp at the sleeves, his AOR 2 green digital woodland trousers darkened by saltwater blown through the broken window, and his brown combat boots planted wide on the warped floorboards, still carrying himself with the controlled precision of a Navy SEAL operative, even as exhaustion hollowed his face and the cold pulled hard at his joints. Scout, his 8-year-old sable German Shepherd K9, moved in a slow patrol around the room, thick brown-gold coat streaked with black along his spine, dark mask, sharp beneath alert amber eyes, one front paw, newly wrapped, where Grace Miller had cleaned the scrape that morning. Yet, his posture remained focused and protective, as if every groan in the walls and every change in the wind belonged to a threat he was responsible for reading before Nathan had to. The storm reached them just after dark, not as a single crash but as a steady tightening of the world, first with rain striking the roof like thrown gravel, then sleet driven sideways through the missing window, then a low roar from the ocean that climbed the cliff and wrapped itself around the cottage until the walls shuddered with each gust. Nathan dragged what loose boards he could find across the window frame, using old nails bent nearly useless by rust, a strip of rope from the porch, and the kind of improvisation that had once kept men alive with less than this in places where no help was coming. He worked without speaking, jaw clenched, breath steaming in the cold room, while Scout stood behind him with his ears forward and his body angled toward the door, tolerating each hammer strike only because Nathan's hand returned to his fur between blows. Outside, somewhere higher on the hill, the old lighthouse answered the wind with its irregular metallic tapping, chain against rail or loose plate against stone, and although Nathan forced himself to keep moving, each sharp sound slipped under his ribs like a memory trying to find the old wound it knew best. Near midnight, the cottage gave its first real warning, a deep wooden complaint above the hearth where the roofline sagged toward the ocean side, and Scout reacted before Nathan saw anything shift. The dog barked once, short and commanding, not fear but instruction, then seized Nathan's coat sleeve and pulled backward with the hard, practiced urgency of a partner who had learned long ago that hesitation could cost blood. Nathan stumbled away from the center of the room just as the wind tore through the weakened roof, ripping loose a section of shingles and tar paper, and icy rain poured down in a sudden sheet, bringing splinters, dust, and black water with it. A cracked rafter dropped from above, with a violent snap, swinging toward the place where Scout had been a heartbeat earlier, and Nathan moved on instinct, twisting his body and shoving the German Shepherd hard toward the wall before the beam smashed into the floorboards with enough force to send a spray of rotten wood across the room. Scout yelped once, more from surprise than pain, then scrambled back to Nathan, pressing his wet body against his legs while the storm screamed through the opening overhead, as if furious that both of them were still alive. For a long while, there was nothing heroic to do except endure. So, Nathan and Scout huddled in the safest corner beneath the least damaged joist, the dog stretched across Nathan's thighs in that deliberate, weighted position that had pulled him out of more than one flashback, while Nathan kept one arm around Scout's chest and one hand braced against the wall as the cottage flexed under the wind. The water on the floor crept around them in shallow, freezing lines, and the metallic tapping from the lighthouse came and went behind the roar, sometimes distant, sometimes so close in Nathan's mind that his breathing began to fracture. He closed his eyes and counted what was real. Scout's weight, cedar wall, salt air, broken roof, Maine coast, not dust, not heat, not the last mission. Scout seemed to feel each break in him before it widened, lowering his head against Nathan's hand, breathing slowly enough that Nathan could borrow the rhythm. By the time the storm began to lose its first rage, the cottage was colder, wetter, and more damaged than before. But it had not fallen into the sea, and neither had they. Dawn came bruised and gray, with rain fading into mist and the sea still striking the rocks below in heavy white bursts, and Nathan rose stiffly from the corner to find the room transformed into a wreckage of soaked boards, torn roofing, and muddy footprints from their own desperate movement in the night. He checked Scout first, running both hands carefully along the dog's shoulders, ribs, legs, and wrapped paw, murmuring reassurance when Scout leaned into him with a tired sigh. The rafter had missed him. The roof had not taken them. That alone felt like a kind of mercy. Nathan spent the morning clearing debris with numb fingers, stacking broken shingles near the hearth, dragging the fallen rafter aside inch by inch, and pushing rainwater toward the threshold with a piece of split board, while Scout followed close despite the stiffness in his movements. It was during this cleanup, when the storm had become only a cold breath moving through the roof wound, that Scout stopped at the far corner, near the old iron bed frame, lowered his nose to the floor, and began scratching at a patch of boards darker than the rest. At first, Nathan thought the dog had caught the scent of mice or rot, but Scout persisted with a quiet intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly different, scraping with one paw, sniffing, then glancing back at Nathan in the same clear, unblinking way he had looked at the notice board in town. Nathan crouched beside him and brushed away grit, finding that the boards in that corner did not match the others. They were narrower, older perhaps, but cut with straighter edges, as if someone had lifted and replaced them many times before trying to hide the habit. He pried at one seam with his pocket knife, then another, the blade slipping in wet wood until a hidden iron ring emerged beneath a packed layer of dirt and salt-stained dust. The ring was cold enough to sting his fingers. He pulled once and nothing happened. He pulled again with both hands, boots braced, and the floor groaned open, revealing a shallow square hatch and darkness beneath it. A small cellar space, no deeper than a man's chest, but dry enough to have been protected from the worst of the years. Scout lowered his head and sniffed the opening, then gave a soft huff, not warning this time, but confirmation. Inside the hidden space sat a dented tin box wrapped in oilcloth, the cloth stiff with age but still sealed tightly enough to keep out damp, and Nathan lifted it carefully, as though it might contain something breakable in more ways than one. He set it on the driest section of counter, peeled back the oilcloth, and opened the rusted latch. The box held black and white photographs of men standing outside the same cottage, when its walls were newer, and the lighthouse still wore clean white paint, their faces young in some pictures, and deeply tired in others. Several military insignia dulled by time, folded letters tied with cord, and a hand-drawn map marked with lines from the cottage to the lighthouse, then to a small square near the lantern room, labeled only with 3 words, Last Light Chamber. Nathan read the first letter slowly, then the next, and the room around him seemed to shift as the old voices rose from the paper. The writer spoke of men coming home to Greyhaven with shaking hands, with no family left, with benefits delayed, with nightmares nobody wanted at kitchen tables, and of the cottage as a place where they could sleep near the sea without being asked to explain the war before breakfast. Grace arrived later that afternoon under a low sky, carrying soup in a thermos and a roll of dry cloth tucked under one arm, her auburn braid tied back tighter than before, her face pale from the climb and from the sight of the torn roof. Yet she did not waste time on panic. She helped Nathan spread the letters across the counter, careful with each page, her nurse's steadiness returning to her hands, even while her eyes betrayed the old wound opening inside her. When Nathan showed her the letter signed Thomas Miller, her breath caught so sharply that Scout lifted his head from the hearth. The handwriting was firm, slanted, unmistakably familiar to her, and as Grace read aloud, her voice trembled only once. "If I do not come back from North Point, tell Grace I was not chasing ghosts. Look for the room behind the last light. The list is real, and so are the men they tried to forget." For several seconds, the only sound was the ocean below, and water dripping from the broken roof into a dented pan Nathan had placed beneath it. Grace pressed the paper to her chest, the old silver dog tag at her throat resting against her knuckles, and in her eyes Nathan saw grief changing shape into something sharper, not peace yet, not justice, but belief. Her father had not wandered blindly into a storm. He had found something, hidden something, or died protecting something, and the cottage Nathan had bought for $8 was no longer simply a roof over two survivors. As evening settled over North Point Head, Nathan returned the photographs, insignia, letters, and map to the tin box, but he did not put it back beneath the floor, because some things, once uncovered, did not belong in the dark again. Grace stood at the broken window, looking up toward the lighthouse, its tower half erased by fog, the lantern room black against the heavy sky, while Scout sat between her and Nathan, ears angled toward the hill as though he understood that the storm had not ended so much as revealed the shape of the next one. Nathan felt the ache in his bones, the cold in his clothes, the familiar weight of danger gathering beyond sight, but beneath it was something else now, a connection to every forgotten man whose name might have passed through this room, every veteran who had sat where he stood and wondered whether coming home was supposed to feel so lonely. Grace folded her father's letter with reverence and looked at Nathan, no longer just the woman from the diner who had brought coffee to a stranger, but a daughter standing at the edge of an answer, years overdue. "He was here," she said quietly. "And whatever he found, it's still up there." Nathan followed her gaze to the lighthouse, his hand settling into Scout's sable fur, and the chapter of survival he had thought he was living became something larger, older, and far more dangerous. The morning after Grace Miller read her father's letter, North Point Head felt changed. Not brighter or safer, but charged with the uneasy stillness of a place that had finally begun to remember what it had tried to bury, while the sea below the cliff rolled in dark green folds, and a hard northern wind carried the smell of salt, wet cedar, and coming snow through the torn roof of the $8 cottage. Nathan Cole stood inside the damaged room, with the dented tin box open on the counter, his lean frame bent over the hand-drawn map, his faded U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3 blouse and AOR 2 green digital woodland trousers still damp from the storm repairs, brown combat boots planted on the uneven floor as Scout, his 8-year-old sable German Shepherd K9, with a black-marked muzzle, amber eyes, and a thick battle-worn body that moved with quiet purpose despite age, watched the doorway with the patience of a soldier who did not trust silence, simply because it had stopped making noise. Grace had returned to town before sunrise, with Thomas Miller's copied letter tucked beneath her coat, her silver dog tag hidden under her scarf, and Nathan had been left with the feeling that the cottage was no longer merely shelter, because every photograph, every folded page, every faded insignia inside the box pointed toward the lighthouse above them, like an old hand, refusing to stay buried. Wade Mercer arrived just before noon, when the fog thinned enough to reveal the black line of the access road and the pale shape of the lighthouse standing beyond the trees, and he came not on foot like a neighbor, but in a polished black pickup that looked wrong against the mud, salt, and wind-bent grass of North Point Head. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s. Tall, clean-shaven, except for a close dark beard shaped with expensive precision, with thick brown hair combed back, a wool coat over outdoor clothes too new to have earned the stains of real work, and eyes that were blue, cold, and measuring in a way that made every glance feel like an appraisal. Wade owned Mercer Coastal Ventures, a tourism company that had spent the last 2 years promising Greyhaven jobs, renovated trails, luxury rentals, guided lighthouse tours, and a future polished, clean enough for brochures. And he carried himself with the confidence of a man whose family name had opened doors before he reached them. He stopped a few yards from the porch, looked at the patched roof, the broken window, the rope brace, Scout beside Nathan's leg, and smiled as if he had found a mistake someone else would soon correct. "You're Nathan Cole," Wade said, making the name sound less like a greeting than a file he had already read. And when Nathan nodded without stepping down from the porch, Wade lifted one gloved hand toward the cliff and the lighthouse beyond it. This property was not supposed to be transferred to a private buyer. Not now. Not with the town development review already underway. Nathan watched his mouth more than his hands, reading tone, rhythm, restraint. While Scout's ears angled forward and his body tightened with a low awareness, Wade seemed too proud to notice. Nathan took the deed from inside his coat, unfolded it with care, and held it out without argument. "County sold it. I paid the bid. My name is on it." Wade glanced at the paper but did not take it, his smile thinning. "Paper is funny in old towns, Mr. Cole. Sometimes it says one thing because no one has bothered to update what matters. My company is preparing to restore this entire stretch. Cottages, Lighthouse Trail, Cliff Road, all of it. You don't want to be the outsider clinging to rot because you mistook a clerical error for a second chance." Nathan folded the deed again, slipped it back into his coat, and answered with the same quiet control that had carried him through rooms far more dangerous than this one. "Then your company can talk to the county. Until then, stay off my porch." For a moment, Wade's expression lost its polish, and something older showed beneath it. Not anger alone, but possession, the kind of offense a man feels when a thing he already imagined owning refuses to move. He looked past Nathan toward the cottage interior, where the tin box had been covered with a blanket but not hidden well enough to fool someone already suspicious. Then his eyes flicked toward the old lighthouse and back. "People who come here usually leave," he said softly. "The storms do it. The isolation does it. Sometimes, the history does it. North Point has a way of reminding strangers they don't belong." Scout let out a low growl then, deep enough to make Wade finally look down, and Nathan rested 2 fingers on the dog's collar, not restraining him so much as acknowledging the warning. Wade stepped back, boots crushing the wet grass, and before he climbed into the truck, he added one more sentence, with a smile that had no warmth left in it. "Be careful what you dig up, Cole. Old ground has old teeth." The first sign came that evening, when Nathan climbed onto the porch roof to tighten the rope brace he had tied after the storm, and found the line cut clean through, not frayed by wind, not snapped by strain, but sliced with a blade and left dangling where the next hard gust could have torn the patch loose. He stood there in the cold, holding the severed end between his fingers, and felt Scout watching from below, the dog's head lifted, nostrils working the air around the porch steps. The second sign came the following morning, when the small stack of driftwood Nathan had dragged from the shore was gone, and after a search he found part of it scattered down the cliff path, several pieces thrown so far toward the rocks that only the tide could claim them. The third sign waited on the cottage door 2 nights later. A red slash of paint across the weathered wood, bright against gray cedar, wet enough to shine under Nathan's lantern, crude enough to pretend it was vandalism, deliberate enough to be a message. Nathan did not remove it right away. He stood in front of it with Scout pressed against his leg and understood that Wade Mercer was trying to turn the cottage back into what the town had believed it to be, a place no one should want badly enough to defend. While Nathan repaired what Wade had damaged, Grace began working the other end of the thread in Greyhaven, moving through town records with a quiet urgency that changed the way people looked at her across counters and filing desks. At the municipal archive, she met Martha Keene, the town records clerk, a small woman in her late 60s, with round glasses, soft white hair, and a cardigan buttoned crookedly, because she cared more about order in paper than order in clothing. Martha had known Thomas Miller as a polite, stubborn man who brought coffee to clerks and asked questions nobody wanted written down. And although she was cautious by habit, age had made her less afraid of local power than younger people expected. She let Grace review old hearing notices, land transfer minutes, and coastal access petitions. And there, beneath years of bland language, Grace found Thomas's name appearing again and again beside objections to Mercer family purchases, objections about veteran refuge land, objections about public access to North Point Lighthouse, objections that stopped abruptly 1 month before he vanished. One handwritten note in the margin of a meeting packet made Grace sit perfectly still. T. Miller claims Mercer deed chain contains false witness signature. Verify before approval. The note had no official follow-up, only a stamp that read postponed, and Grace felt the old grief inside her begin to harden into suspicion. That night, the trap was waiting near the porch where Scout would have stepped first if years of training had not taught him to distrust what men hid in familiar paths. The dog stopped mid-stride, body rigid, one front paw lifted, and a sound rose from him so low, Nathan felt it more than heard it. Nathan raised his lantern and saw the steel jaws tucked beneath a thin cover of dead grass and blown pine needles, open and ready at the edge of the threshold, placed not in the woods for coyotes or foxes, but directly where a man and a dog lived. Back, Nathan said, and Scout obeyed instantly, though every muscle in him pulled toward the threat. Nathan crouched slowly, using a long broken board to press the plate, and when the jaws snapped shut, with a violent metallic crack, the sound detonated through him, ripping the cottage, the cliff, and the cold night away for one blinding second. His lungs seized, his hand went empty, the board dropped. The lantern swung hard shadows across the porch, and suddenly he was not at North Point, but somewhere hotter, louder, where metal clicks meant buried death, and the space between one breath and the next could decide who came home. Scout moved before the memory took him completely, pushing hard into Nathan's chest, then climbing against him with controlled weight, whining once near his ear and forcing Nathan backward until his spine met the cottage wall. Nathan's hands found fur, thick and warm, and he gripped it as if it were the only honest thing left in the world, counting Scout's breath, the salt wind, the cliff, the porch, Maine, present, present, present. It took long minutes for his vision to return fully to the lantern glow and the steel trap lying closed at his feet. When he could stand, his anger was quiet, and therefore more dangerous than shouting. He carried the trap inside with a shovel handle, laid it near the covered tin box, and saw the shape of the whole thing more clearly than before. Wade was not simply trying to scare away a man from a future resort site. He was trying to keep Nathan from the cottage, the map, the lighthouse, and the old paper trail Thomas Miller had died or disappeared trying to protect. The $8 cottage had become a nail lodged in the machinery of Mercer's plan, and if the old files proved the land had been claimed through fraud, Wade's coastal empire would not be built on North Point Head without exposing what his family had buried. Grace returned before midnight, breathless from the trail, her coat wet with fog, Martha Keene's copied records sealed in a folder beneath her arm, and when she saw the trap on the floor, the red mark still on the door, and Nathan's pale, controlled face, she understood that the old story had become present danger. She spread the records beside the map from the cellar, her finger tracing the same boundaries Thomas had challenged years earlier, while Nathan marked the lighthouse route and the small square labeled Last Light Chamber. My father knew the Mercer deed was wrong, Grace said, voice low but no longer uncertain. He tried to stop the sale, and then he vanished. Nathan looked toward the dark window, where the lighthouse was nothing but a black shape above the cliff, and felt Scout settle beside him. Steady, watchful, alive. Then we split the work, he said. You find every record they tried to bury in town. I follow the map and find what he hid up there. Grace nodded, fear and resolve standing together in her eyes. And outside the cottage, the wind moved over North Point Head, as if it had been waiting years for someone to say the truth aloud. By late afternoon, Greyhaven had sunk beneath a fog so thick it erased the harbor, softened the cliffs, and turned North Point Head into a gray world of salt air, wet stone, and hidden edges, while Nathan Cole stood outside the $8 cottage, with the hand-drawn map folded inside his coat and Scout pressed close at his left side. The 8-year-old sable German Shepherd K9 moving with the same disciplined alertness that had carried him through war, storm, and every silent hour when Nathan's mind had tried to abandon the present. Nathan wore the same practical uniform that had become less a memory of service than a structure holding him together, the U.S. Navy Working Uniform Type 3 blouse, in AOR 2 green digital woodland, matching trousers, and brown combat boots darkened by mud and sea mist. And although his face was tired, his gray eyes stayed steady on the broken white tower above the cottage, where the old North Point lighthouse rose out of the fog like something waiting to be judged. Grace Miller climbed the last stretch of trail from town, with a records folder sealed beneath her coat, her auburn braid damp against her collar, her hazel eyes, sharpened by grief and purpose. No longer only the woman who had offered coffee to a stranger, but a daughter walking toward the place that had swallowed her father's name for years. They entered the lighthouse through a warped service door behind the oil shed, because the main entrance had been chained long ago, and the first breath inside carried the smell of rust, gull droppings, rotted rope, and old kerosene sunk deep into the stone. Scout went first, nose low, shoulders rolling with careful control as his claws clicked against the damp floor, and Nathan followed with one hand near the dog's collar, while Grace kept close behind, her flashlight shaking only when it caught the spiraling iron staircase that climbed into darkness. The lighthouse had not been maintained in years. Flakes of white paint peeled from the curved walls, sea wind slipped through cracks around the narrow windows, and each step of the staircase groaned beneath them with a metallic complaint that made Nathan's pulse tighten, though he did not stop. He forced himself to read the present the way Scout did, one scent, one surface, one breath at a time, while Grace whispered that her father used to say lighthouses were built for people who might never know who saved them, and the words settled between them with a weight Nathan understood too well. Halfway up, they reached the old oil room, a narrow chamber built into the side of the tower where dented cans, broken lantern parts, frayed rope coils, and a collapsed wooden rack lay beneath a coat of dust. Scout stopped immediately, body still, ears forward, nose working along the rear wall where the boards looked as weathered as everything else, but did not smell the same. He scratched once near the base, then looked back at Nathan with the same silent certainty that had led him to the auction notice and the hatch beneath the cottage floor. Nathan knelt and ran his fingers along the seams, finding a line too straight to belong to age, and Grace moved the flashlight slowly upward until the beam caught a small brass nail head shaped like a star, dulled almost black with time. Nathan pressed it. Nothing moved at first. Then the boards gave a soft inward click, and a false wall opened just wide enough for cold air to breathe out from behind it, carrying dust, paper, and a faint dry scent of cedar that had somehow survived the damp decades. The room beyond was small, no larger than a storage closet, but it held the kind of silence that made both Nathan and Grace understand they had crossed from rumor into truth. Shelves lined the walls, some sagging, some still firm, and on them sat cloth-wrapped journals, bundles of letters tied with faded cord, service photographs, old discharge papers, county envelopes, and small personal objects left by men who had passed through the cottage when there had been nowhere else for them to go. There was a cracked harmonica, a rosary with 2 beads missing, a folded flag sealed in yellowed paper, a child's drawing addressed only to Dad, and a ledger whose first page read, in careful handwriting, North Point Refuge, names remembered here until the world remembers them properly. Nathan lifted the ledger with more reverence than he expected, seeing names, units, dates, notes about nightmares, missing benefits, lost families, men who slept beside the sea because no one had left a lamp on for them anywhere else, and he felt the room close around him, not like a trap, but like a gathering of witnesses. This was the last light, not the lamp above them, but the final place where forgotten men had been allowed to remain human. Grace found her father's box on the lowest shelf, hidden behind 2 canvas document rolls and marked with the initials T.M. in black ink almost rubbed away, and for a moment she could not open it because her hands had become the hands of a child again, waiting at a window while adults told her the storm had taken what they could not return. Nathan did not rush her. Scout sat beside her, leaning his warm shoulder into her knee with the quiet instinct that made even strangers lower their guard around him, and Grace finally lifted the lid. Inside were Thomas Miller's field notebook, several copied deeds, a photograph of Thomas in his late 50s, standing beside the lighthouse, with a tired smile and silver hair combed back by the wind, and another photograph showing Wade Mercer much younger beside his father, Clayton Mercer, a broad, thick-necked man with heavy brows, expensive boots, and the hard stare of someone accustomed to making public generosity cover private hunger. Clayton had been praised in old Greyhaven newspapers as a developer, donor, and friend of the town. But Thomas's notes described another man entirely, one who pressured families to sell, altered witness lines, and used storms, debts, and silence to turn refuge land into investment land before anyone understood what had been taken. The notebook made Grace's face change as she read, sorrow giving way to a kind of stunned clarity, because Thomas had written plainly that he was not afraid of the sea, not afraid of the weather, and not chasing myths, but afraid that if he failed, the last protected record of North Point Refuge would vanish into Mercer hands. He had recorded meetings with Clayton Mercer and a younger Wade, threats delivered outside the municipal office, warnings that Grace would lose the diner if Thomas kept digging, and a final entry written the day before the storm that made her voice break when she read it aloud. If I do not come home, it will not be because I walked into weather blind. I am hiding the proof behind the last light, because truth sometimes needs a locked room and someone patient enough to find the key. Grace pressed the notebook to her chest, eyes shining, and the years of wondering whether her father had abandoned sense, family, or life itself shifted beneath her. He had not left her for obsession. He had stood between the Mercers and the last place lonely veterans had been allowed to belong. Nathan gathered the most important documents into the old canvas satchel Grace had brought, moving with deliberate speed as the fog outside darkened toward evening, while Scout paced the oil room entrance with increasing tension. The dog's nose lifted once, twice, then his whole body stiffened, and a low growl rolled through the hidden room before either human heard anything below. Nathan froze. Grace stopped tying the satchel. From the tower shaft beneath them came the faint scrape of a boot on iron, then the soft clink of something metal, and with it, a smell that Scout recognized before Nathan could name it. Gasoline. Scout barked then, sharp and violent, and Nathan grabbed Grace's arm, pulling her from the hidden room just as an orange flicker bloomed below the stairwell, thin at first, then spreading with hungry speed through old oil residue, dry rope, and dust that had waited years to burn. Wade Mercer was already retreating through the lower service door when Nathan saw him through the smoke, his polished coat dark in the fog, one hand still holding an empty fuel can, his face twisted not with panic, but with fury, that the room had been found before he could erase it. Nathan shouted his name, but Wade vanished into the gray, boots pounding down the outer trail, and Nathan had only one choice left because Grace was coughing hard behind him, clutching the satchel with one arm while smoke rolled up the stairwell, and heat began to chew at the oil room walls. Scout drove forward through the smoke, not away from danger but toward Grace, barking again until she moved. And Nathan wrapped one arm around her waist while keeping the other hand on the rail, guiding her down step by step as flames licked along the old storage shelves behind them. The metallic groan of heated iron tore through Nathan's skull, dragging war close enough to taste. But Scout looked back at him through the smoke with amber eyes bright and absolute, and Nathan followed the dog instead of the memory. They reached the lower landing as a burning section of shelf collapsed above, sending sparks down the tower shaft, and Grace stumbled, the satchel slipping from her grip and sliding toward the edge of the stairs. Nathan shoved her toward the doorway and turned back before fear could negotiate with him, his boots skidding on wet stone, one sleeve catching sparks as he lunged for the canvas bag. Scout stayed with him, body low, barking through the smoke, and together they forced their way out through the service door, into the freezing fog, just as the hidden room above began to roar. Grace fell to her knees in the wet grass, coughing, tears cutting clean lines through soot on her face, while Nathan dropped the satchel in front of her and bent over Scout, checking the dog's eyes, paws, and breathing with hands that shook only after the danger had moved behind them. The lighthouse glowed from within now, not with its old saving beam but with fire, and the sight made Grace clutch the rescued box and notebook against her chest as if she were holding the last living piece of her father. In the cold grass below North Point Lighthouse, with smoke twisting into the fog, and Wade's footsteps already lost somewhere down the cliff road, Grace finally understood the shape of the wound she had carried for years. Thomas Miller had not abandoned her, and he had not died because he was careless with storms. He had risked everything to protect the truth, the land, and the hidden names of men who had come home from war only to be forgotten by the very town they had served. Nathan stood beside her with one hand buried in Scout's sable fur, his face lit by fire and fog, knowing that the documents in the satchel had cost more than time and might still cost more before the end, while Scout leaned against both of them, as if holding the broken pieces of two lives in place. Grace wiped soot from the silver dog tag at her throat, then looked at the burning lighthouse, not with the helpless grief of a daughter left behind, but with the steadier grief of someone who had finally been given purpose. "He saved it for someone to find," she whispered, voice raw but certain. Nathan looked down at the rescued box, then toward the trail, where Wade had disappeared. "Then we make sure it was worth it," he said, and behind them the last light burned, no longer hidden, no longer silent. By morning, the fire inside North Point Lighthouse had burned itself down to blackened beams, wet ash, and a bitter smoke that drifted over the cliff like the last breath of a secret finally forced into daylight, while Nathan Cole stood beside the $8 cottage, with soot still streaked across his faded U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3 blouse, AOR 2 green digital woodland trousers damp from the fog, and brown combat boots planted in the muddy grass, as if the ground beneath him had become something he was no longer willing to lose. Scout, his 8-year-old sable German Shepherd K9, stayed at his left side with his brown gold fur darkened by smoke near the shoulders, his black-marked muzzle lifted toward the trail, and his amber eyes watching every movement with the same quiet intelligence that had carried Nathan through war, exile, storm, and fire. Grace Miller sat on the cottage step with Thomas Miller's rescued notebook held in both hands, her auburn braid loose, soot along one cheek, the silver dog tag at her throat shining through the grime, and when the sound of tires came up the cliff road, none of them moved away from the evidence, because hiding was what had allowed the Mercers to rule North Point for too long. Sheriff Daniel Brooks arrived first, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with dark skin weathered by Maine winters, close-cropped gray hair, a heavy mustache, and the calm, deliberate manner of a lawman who had spent more of his life preventing panic than chasing drama. He was not quick to speak, and not quick to judge, partly because Greyhaven had taught him that every story in a small town arrived tangled in old debts, old pride, and old fear. But when he stepped from his cruiser and saw the fuel can Nathan had recovered near the lighthouse door, the scorched oil room entrance, the rescued deeds, Thomas Miller's notes, and the copied records Grace had brought from town, his face hardened with the quiet anger of a man realizing the law had been sleeping while power worked in the dark. Wade Mercer was found 2 hours later near the service road, trying to leave Greyhaven in the same polished black pickup that had looked so confident at the cottage days before, his expensive coat stained with smoke, his hands scraped, his story already falling apart before Daniel asked the second question. Nathan watched from a distance as the sheriff placed Wade in handcuffs, and although there was no triumph in the moment, only exhaustion and cold air, something in North Point Head seemed to loosen, as if the cliff itself had been holding its breath for years. The evidence did not heal everything overnight, because towns do not change their bones in a single morning, but it was enough to stop the resort project before the first luxury foundation could be poured into stolen ground. The county reviewed the deed chain, the council withdrew approval from Mercer Coastal Ventures and North Point Head, including the cottage, the lighthouse trail, and the land once used as a refuge for forgotten veterans, was placed under community protection, while Nathan's ownership of the cottage was formally recognized. At the town meeting, where people packed into the same municipal room that had once laughed at the $8 bid, Martha Keene, the small white-haired records clerk who had helped Grace uncover the files, stood with a folder clutched against her cardigan and read Thomas Miller's old objections aloud, in a voice that shook but did not break. Harlan Pike, the old fisherman with the cane and pipe-roughened voice, sat in the front row and removed his cap when Thomas's name was spoken, while Sarah Bell from the Harbor Line rooms stood in the back with her thin hands folded tight, her anxious face marked by shame. And though she did not ask Nathan for forgiveness that day, she looked at him differently, as if she finally understood that fear had made her send a good man into the storm. Then came the repairs, not as charity, and not as a public apology anyone named too directly, but as people arriving with hammers, panes of glass, tar paper, hinges, nails, rope, canvas, coffee, soup, old lumber, and the awkward kindness of a town trying to rebuild trust one useful act at a time. Everett Boone, the careful county clerk who had sold Nathan the cottage with a dry voice and a gavel tap, brought a stack of salvaged cedar boards from his brother's shed and admitted, without quite meeting Nathan's eyes, that paperwork sometimes found the right owner by accident. Earl Pritchard, the harbor foreman whose call had helped start the night that pushed Nathan out, came with 2 dock hands and a truckload of roof panels, his red windburned face serious beneath his wool cap, and he worked beside Nathan for a full afternoon before finally saying that men could be wrong about what they called a liability. Grace organized food from the diner. Martha labeled old records for preservation. Harlan taught 2 teenagers how to brace the cliffside fence against winter wind, and Scout lay on the porch between all of them, with the solemn authority of a foreman, accepting ear scratches only after sniffing each new hand as though granting permission for the town to come closer. Nathan changed slowly in the weeks that followed, not by forgetting what had happened to him, and not by becoming the easy, smiling version of healing that people sometimes wanted from broken men, but by waking each morning with a place to repair, a dog waiting at the door, and a list of names in the North Point Refuge ledger that reminded him he was not the first man to come home and feel stranded between survival and life. He took small repair jobs around Greyhaven because his hands knew how to make damaged things useful again, fixing swollen doors, broken fences, leaky porch roofs, loose steps, and winter-cracked windows, and people who had once watched him from behind curtains began calling him by name. Scout became known everywhere from the harbor to the diner, moving beside Nathan with his sable coat brightening as spring softened the air, his amber eyes gentle with children but still sharp around careless men. And although he had been trained for danger, the town came to love him most for the way he leaned into trembling strangers as if recognizing weight no one else could see. Nathan never called him a therapy dog, never softened what Scout had been, but he understood that the same loyalty that had saved lives in war was now saving something quieter in peace. Grace reopened her father's dream from the cottage first, because the lighthouse needed more restoration before anyone could safely gather there, and she called it the Last Light Room, in honor of the hidden chamber that had kept the truth alive. She was no longer only the guarded woman behind the diner counter. She became the steady center of a promise Thomas Miller had left unfinished, still practical, still watchful, but warmed by the knowledge that her father's silence had never been abandonment. The first visitors came without announcement. A retired Coast Guard mechanic named Peter Lawson, a thin man in his 70s with shaking hands and kind eyes, who had known Thomas years before. Then, a young former Marine named Ben Walker, broad-built and quiet, unable to sleep since returning from deployment. Then a widow who carried her husband's folded flag in a grocery bag because she had never found the right place to open it. They sat by the repaired hearth, drank coffee, Grace poured into mismatched mugs, and spoke when they could, while Nathan listened more than he answered, and Scout moved from person to person with that patient. Wordless understanding animals sometimes offer better than people. By early summer, the cottage no longer looked like something waiting to collapse into the sea. Its roof was straight, its windows held glass, its door closed properly, and the porch faced the ocean with new railings that smelled of cedar and salt. The path to the lighthouse had been cleared, the burned oil room reinforced, the hidden chamber preserved behind protective glass and restored shelves, and the names from the North Point Refuge ledger were copied into a public memorial, so no one would have to remain hidden to be remembered. Nathan used the same hands that had once held weapons, lifted wounded men, pushed Scout away from falling beams, and dragged evidence from smoke, to build benches, mend stairs, and fit window frames for others who needed shelter from weather they did not know how to name. Every board he set into place felt like an answer to the night Greyhaven had thrown him out, and every person who crossed the threshold proved the cottage had never been useless, only waiting for someone desperate enough to see value where others saw ruin. On the evening the lighthouse lamp was restored, the whole town gathered along the cliff road in a wind softened by summer, with harbor bells faint below and the Atlantic turning gold under the last light of day. Daniel Brooks stood near the fence, with his hat in his hands. Martha Keene cried openly, without apologizing. Harlan Pike leaned on his cane and muttered that Thomas Miller would have complained about the wiring, but loved the result. And Sarah Bell came quietly to the porch steps with a folded wool blanket, placing it beside Nathan without asking him to take it, her thin face humbled by the kind of remorse that did not need an audience. Grace stood beside Nathan in front of the lighthouse, her father's silver dog tag resting against her chest, and when the restored beam turned for the first time in years, sweeping across the darkening sea, across the cottage windows, across the faces of veterans, fishermen, widows, clerks, dockhands, and strangers who had become something close to family, Nathan felt Scout press his warm body against his leg. He lowered one hand into the dog's sable fur and whispered, "I thought this house was only going to save us, boy, but it turns out it's leading a lot more people home." Scout lifted one paw and placed it over Nathan's hand, steady and certain, while the lighthouse beam crossed the water like a promise that even the broken, the forgotten, and the forced out could still find their way back. The lesson of this story is that sometimes God does not send a miracle as a sudden light from the sky. Sometimes He sends it as a loyal dog who refuses to let you give up, as a broken little house that becomes a new beginning, as one kind person who offers coffee in the cold, or as a hidden truth waiting for the right heart to uncover it. Nathan thought he had lost everything when Greyhaven pushed him into the storm, but God was quietly guiding his steps toward the place where his pain would become purpose. In our daily lives, we may also feel forgotten, rejected, tired, or too broken to begin again. But this story reminds us that God can use even the smallest door, even an $8 cottage, even one faithful companion, to lead us back home. Never believe that your life is over just because one chapter was painful. God can rebuild what the world tried to destroy, and He can turn your scars into shelter for someone else. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to let us know you were here, and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, healing, justice, and redemption. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen your heart, and guide every lost soul back toward peace. If you believe that God can still create miracles from broken places, comment Amen.